Welcome to The Big Picture, a show that takes a deep dive into the political landscape of not only America, but right here in our own backyard of Illinois.
It's showtime, folks.
The Big Picture is on WCPT 820. And now, here's your host, Edwin Eisendrath.
Hello, everybody. Happy Saturday. It's a bright, sunny, if a little chilly day here in the upper Midwest, and another whopper of a week. Boy, I have a lot of thoughts about this week. I mean, this week, Donald Trump and his lawless regime had 11 big setbacks in courts of law all around the country. On cue, of course, his administration arrested a county judge in Milwaukee and then went on Fox and Twitter to brag about it. Instead of the usual, we don't comment on ongoing cases, we got a very public warning to all judges that compliance is not optional. Crazy, right? Collectively, Americans in red states and blue ones are appalled. Trump's poll numbers are reaching Marianas Trench territory, from whence no politician ever returns. Thank goodness. Trump is desperate. His tariffs ended our strong economic recovery and brought inflation back. He says he's negotiating with China, but China says it hasn't picked up the phone. He promised peace in Ukraine, and that promised peace in Ukraine has morphed into a promise to defeat Ukraine. Are you kidding? Instead of peace in the Middle East, we are perilously close to a wider war between Israel and Iran, with no relief in sight for suffering Palestinians and hostages still in caves or tunnels. Seriously? He's got nothing right. Americans are coming down with measles, and now the administration has given up even trying to stop salmonella. As ever, Trump resorts to lying about it all. And his partners in the media, his partners share every falsehood as if it were gospel. And so this week, with all that going on, I've been thinking about the lying. I've been thinking about it. Trump is the master, but he's not the only one doing it. Lying has become an identity marker. It's a way for MAGA members to signal to each other that they're on the same team. Lying to the public and to the press isn't meant to fool any of us. That's not the point. It's meant to signal fealty among themselves. That's really dangerous. Kash Patel promised MAGA he had an enemies list. Then he went before Congress in confirmation hearings to lead the FBI, and he said, here's a quote, "I have no interest, no desire, and will not, if confirmed, go backwards." And he promised, again, another quote, "There will be no politicization of the FBI. There will be no retributive actions taken." Oh, look, that's a lie. He's already taken somebody from that enemies list of his, and we have this judge now. MAGA knows it's a lie, and they know we know it's a lie, and that's why they love him. Let's go back to that arrest in Milwaukee. Look, I have no idea whether the judge did anything inappropriate. We really don't know what they're even alleging, really, that she let the guy out a second door instead of the same door, but in the same hall. Doesn't make any sense. But over the years, plenty of judges have done things that are wrong. Here in Illinois, we once had something called Operation Greylord. Do you remember that? The federal authorities investigated and then charged and then convicted judges of taking bribes. In no case was it necessary to storm into a courtroom and to handcuff and arrest a judge. That's the sort of thing you see in, old World War II movies. And people are saying Bondi and Patel are out trying to intimidate judges. And that's true, but it's only half the story. After all, the judges, they're doing their job. The intimidation part isn't working. The other explanation for this very public arrest and the subsequent publicity is that it's meant to create social media clips to feed Donald Trump's lying propaganda machine. It's about the lies. Over at the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth tells everyone he can, and particularly Fox News, which he's on all the time, that everything's fine, but the mainstream press is out to get him. More lies, and they're amplified in right-wing media, and they're meant to obscure the reality that in just a few months, Hegseth, otherwise known as G.I. Joke, has mishandled classified information, created dysfunction in the armed services, and lost the trust of our troops. Why does he still have a job? Because of that other lie, that looking the part and following the president's orders is somehow the same thing as being competent and prepared for the work. Look, I want to give you two more examples of the MAGA crowd using lies to signal their group identity. And this is disgusting. And by the way, one is from a handful of southern states and the other from the bench of the United States Supreme Court, and they are related. This year, governors in 9 states signed proclamations declaring April, the month we are still in, to be Confederate Heritage Month. Confederate Heritage Month. Well, everything about what they did is a lie. What they claim that heritage is a lie. What they pretend it isn't is another lie. What they secretly hope it will become. In Mississippi, the governor signed the proclamation in secret, and instead of putting it on the state's website, he sent it to the sons of Confederate veterans. Hey guys, I'm with you, just don't tell anybody. These are liars who nod and wink at each other and pretend that that heritage isn't vile as they cheer a new administration that plainly wants to turn the clock back. During Confederate Heritage Month, over at the Supreme Court, there were oral arguments on a case. This case was Louisiana versus Calais and Robertson versus Calais. They combined those two. The cases will determine whether the court can get rid of the last leg of the Voting Rights Act, the only part they've left standing. And from the bench, Justice Kavanaugh asked whether it was time or whether time had moved on, whether the idea of protecting minority voters had aged out of relevance. We've been doing this for years, he said. Maybe we don't need to do it anymore. Well, Kavanaugh isn't the only justice to argue we no longer need laws to protect Black Americans from organized bigotry. In the Shelby versus Holder case, John Roberts said the days of racially discriminatory map making are over. And of course, his decision in that case led immediately to a new round of racially discriminating maps. Kavanaugh knows this. His questions are just another form of lying. He knows that the U.S. government, that the administration of the president who appointed him has removed Jackie Robinson's story from libraries. He knows that the U.S. Department of Justice in this administration has ordered the Civil Rights Division to protect white men. He knows that the National Park Service in this administration now teaches the story of the Underground Railroad without its conductor, Harriet Tubman. It is not a question to be debated whether Donald Trump issued an executive order to undo the Civil Rights Act. It is a fact. Have we aged out of needing laws to protect Americans from this kind of thing? Kavanaugh knows the answer to that. He is lying in his questions to signal his membership in that tribe. Today's traitors, and that's what they are no less eager to destroy our democracy than Jefferson Davis and the other Confederates. And it's similar, right? Once again, a powerful and wealthy group of Americans would repudiate the Declaration of Independence and say that some men are meant to rule over the rest of us. And by the way, with this crowd, meant to profit immeasurably from the labor of others. Elon Musk and his data machine are bent on it. Donald Trump and his propaganda machine are determined to achieve it. And telling lies is the badge of honor they use to signal membership in their vile little rebellion. Americans hate it. His polling is, it's like locked in the bathysphere and heading to the bottom of the ocean. Thank goodness. But look, all of these lies, this is why bearing witness is so important. This is why journalism is so important. And it's why it has ever been important in the fight for freedom. But don't confuse bearing witness and telling the truth with an effort to convince the hardcore MAGA crowd of anything. The time for convincing is over. The facts are no longer in dispute. The case is proven. I don't care if they believe it or not anymore. Good Americans see what's going on. Good Americans on the left and the right. So speak out bravely. Don't believe them when they say, oh, you're too strident. Be done with half measures. Be done with polite requests. Oh, don't do that. Instead, stand in their way. Slow them down. Let's go after the weakest supporters in Congress. Let's protect our elections. Then let's turn them out and repudiate their evil reign. And look, on their ashes, let's build a new America that respects truth and works for all of us. We're going to explore all of these themes in a fabulous show today. We have some great guests. Tiffany Muller from End Citizens United is going to kick us off as soon as we come back after a brief break.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
All right, let's get right into it with Tiffany Muller. She's, of course, leads End Citizens United, that incredibly important organization fighting vast corruption that's in our politics. She, has grown that organization. She's educated America about the god-awful effects of that erroneous Supreme Court decision. And she's fought against the, not very secret anymore, corruption of American politics. And I, of course, love that she got started as a city council member back in Kansas. Tiffany, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me back on, Edwin. It's great to be with you.
Boy, do we have a lot to talk about.
Oh, it has been quite the 100 days, hasn't it?
It has been for the record books. I don't know, so many places to start. Let's start with this. With these arrogant billionaires like Elon Musk offering to pay for elections of MAGA loyalists or to primary any Republican who has, who has even the slightest DNA of a backbone left. We see members of Congress every day now choosing to violate their oath to defend the Constitution because they're afraid or they're bought. You knew we would get here. You knew it. You warned us all. But now I think Americans can no longer pretend it's an abstract argument. Don't you think people now see it?
Yeah, I think that they are seeing it. Not only are they seeing it in all of the examples that you just said, but they're feeling it in their own day-to-day lives, Edwin. I mean, whether it's the cost of groceries continuing to go up while corporations keep pocketing the largest profits ever and continue to give more and more money to Trump to grease their wheels, or if it's, Musk trying to buy not only the presidential election for $300 million and then becoming the most powerful person in our government, but now, like you said, he's rewarding members of Congress by saying that he will back their race, or if they don't do what he says, he'll back their primary opponent. He tried to buy the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. But I think people not only see it and recognize the corruption for what it is, but I think they're feeling it in those day-to-day, the cost, the fact that their wages continue to be stagnant, the fact that prescription drug prices continue to rise, that housing prices continue to rise. I mean, we are really in a rigged, corrupted system, and it's been corrupted by all the big money. And sadly, this is the culmination of what 15 years of Citizens United has done for us. Yeah.
So I think what you said was very important. Maybe skipped a step that's worth going back and spending a little more time on, and that is that there's a direct connection between the feelings, the experience everyone is having, whether that is of higher prices because of the tariffs, or I can't get solar panels in my community for anything, or or for God knows I'm going to get measles or some other disease from these guys. The bad effects of government are directly related to the corruption. This isn't just a policy conversation. This is policies that are directly a result of a government that is working for interests that aren't ours.
That's exactly right. And I mean, we can break it down by almost any issue that someone cares about, whether it is addressing climate change and seeing how big oil and gas continues to be able to pollute and is now getting access to federal lands that are being opened up for them to drill on, because they spend hundreds of millions of dollars every single election cycle. Or, you know, one of the first things Trump did when he took office is he actually rolled back the $35 cap on insulin, right? This is a drug that we know costs just pennies to make, and yet it had been capped at $35 under President Joe Biden, and that saves people's lives, right? And what did he do? He removed that cap so that Big Pharma could have a bigger profit. And, you know, Big Pharma spends hundreds of millions in our elections, and then they spend hundreds of millions more to have 1,500 lobbyists on Capitol Hill on any given day. And that's all a great investment for them because they're making billions and billions. And then, you know, Trump keeps manufacturing these economic crises as well. You know, he threatens tariffs or puts tariffs on our allies around the globe, driving up the cost on everyday Americans, and then actually tells people and his friends and cronies how to manipulate the market so that they get richer and so that he gets richer. And, you know, we have millions of members across the country, and I travel the country and talk to people all the time. And, you know, they see the chaos, and what they feel like is nobody is looking out for them. Things are getting harder and harder, and they think that no one is looking out for them. But those folks at the top, the Musks of the world, the Jeff Bezos, you know, all your tech titans and billionaires that are in the cabinet, they're all just sitting around lining their pockets and making sure that they get richer.
Yeah, I would say to the people that you talk to that there are lots of us looking out for each other, but we put the people in power who don't care. And if we get rid of them, we will start to look out for each other again. Yeah.
I actually really believe that too, Edwin. I think that one of the things that actually can drive back some of this money is us joining together and demanding change. And I think we saw that in this Wisconsin Supreme Court race. You know, Musk spent tens of millions of dollars to try to buy that race. And they lost, because the people understood what was at stake and they turned out. And so I believe very much that when we come together, the only thing more powerful than this money and this corrupted system is us all joining together and saying, no, we the people are going to stand up for each other.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And we're starting to do it. I mean, but I'll get to that later. I want a few more other things I want to talk to you about before we talk about how we've come together. I was stunned. No, I wasn't. That's wrong. I was pissed off and this week when Donald Trump attacked something called Act Blue. Would you take a minute and tell everybody what Act Blue is and what we should know about this latest hypocritical, ridiculous executive order?
Yeah. So Act Blue, for any of your listeners who have ever given online through an email or a text to a Democratic candidate or an organization that supporting causes they care about, if they've given $5 or $10 or $15, most likely that has been processed through Act Blue. It is really just a payment processing system that most of the Democratic candidates and organizations use. Now, here's the important point. Donald Trump is trying to attack this platform for one simple reason. He is trying to attack his political opponents because they have the billionaire money. They may have the 10 richest people in America giving them hundreds of millions of dollars. But on the Democratic side, what we have is that more of our money comes from the people. The retired teachers, the firefighters, the educators, who really are just giving $5, $10, $15 at a time, whatever they can give to candidates and organizations that they care about. It is close to half of the money in the last presidential election came from these small dollar donors. And so, again, it's what they are trying to do is attack their political opponents to silence the voices of everyday Americans who are just trying to participate in our democracy, to give even more power to their big billionaire backers. That is all this attack is about. And I was really glad to see that they that everyone came together to stand together to say that that's what it was about. But it is ironic to no end that the same guy who fired all the inspectors generals, who have fired the watchdogs who take on corruption, is now trying to call for an investigation, when really what he's doing is weaponizing the federal government and the DOJ to attack his political opponents.
Yep. I mean, he thinks maybe possibly, oh, gosh, campaigns aren't clean. And so he doesn't think that. He's accusing Act Blue of helping launder money to campaigns that shouldn't be there when his party's the one that will not pass a single law that lets us control the money in politics in any way.
That's exactly right. If they were serious about this, they would actually take steps that we know could get some of the dark money, the undisclosed money, the money that we know is actually allowing foreign interference into our election system. They would pass the laws we need, and we could do it today. We don't have to wait on the Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment. We could pass those laws today if they were serious about it. But let's be honest. We know he's not serious about it because he's also selling his own cryptocurrency. Oh,
that's my next question.
Foreign investors, right?
So let's just talk about this. This is the greatest corruption scheme. I got to hand it to him. He is creative about lining his own pocket, and he will be the richest person in the world before he's out of that office. But so he got rid of all of the mechanisms we have to watchdog what happens in cryptocurrency. So, any scammers, any money launderers, anybody who wants to use crypto for their illegal schemes is like, cheering from the loudest rafters. But he's one of them, right? So he said he put this meme coin out, which is a worthless thing, absolutely has no value, except it's a way of giving him money. He owns it. So he says to people, right, if you spend enough money to buy my coin, I'm inviting you to the White House and you can have a sit down with me. So he's selling influence, and he's selling, and the money is going into his own personal pocket. I don't think when the Supreme Court said you're immune for official actions, I don't think this is an official action.
I agree, and you're exactly right. He launches this meme cryptocurrency coin days before taking office, so that he could actually raise billions on it. And again, it has no value. It is worthless. But people who want to curry favor with him are buying it up, including, we know, millions and millions from outside foreign investors, right? So it is a way for foreign money to get into our system and to influence the highest office in the land. And then on top of it, he actually, to your point, they halted all cryptocurrency enforcement team, and it shields him from any type of investigation, conflicts of interest, any kind of ethics regulations around any of this. It is, you are right to call it one of the biggest scams that we've ever seen, but that's what this entire first 100 days has really been. It has been a non-stop, unprecedented level of corruption and chaos and self-dealing, and it's all about using the government to get rich or to get richer for both him and his cronies.
Yeah, this pause you hear is me letting my stomach grumble in rage about this, because it is this disgusting thing. I mean, I was a Chicago city councilman. You were a local legislator, and I watched all my colleagues, and there was a lot of them in those days, go to jail for taking $500 to look the other way when a guy, did a curb cut into the street. Right. But we put people in jail because they were selling their public the public trust. And the bar was, low. You had to really, it was easy to sell out the public, and we didn't want it to happen. And here, we're just being sold out every second. I mean, I don't know how else to understand switching sides in the middle of a war, going from we're going to make peace in Ukraine to we're going to sell out Ukraine, except that, I don't know who's buying the cryptocurrency.
Exactly. It is every time you turn around. I mean, yes, there's the cryptocurrency scam, or how about that Melania Trump just sold the rights to a docuseries about her life for $40 million, and she will personally pocket $28 million of it. And guess
to Jeff Bezos, right?
To Jeff Bezos. Exactly. Yeah. I don't know. I am old enough, Edwin, to remember, I'm pretty sure it was the same Jeff Bezos who bought Washington Post and said democracy dies in darkness. Well, now
he was wrong. It dies in the light of day.
That's right, with his checkbook.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of things have happened to journalism, and now we understand, given the complexities of our economy and how the relationship between large corporations and government, that journalism isn't safe in the hands of big companies that have other interests.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is another, this is another place where you see the fact that journalism has become you have to find ways to make profit at all other expense. Really decimating journalism, and especially investigative journalism and local journalism. And now it is all about the clickbait headlines and what's going to drive the most clicks and what's going to drive the most views. And that is and that profit is what drives all decisions. And it really is a huge disservice to all of us as Americans and our entire media landscape.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to take a while to understand all the damage that these guys are. I mean, Tiffany, we haven't talked about this, and I don't know how we could. I don't know how we know it, but there is an awful lot of money that washes through the Defense Department. And who's watching any of that these days, right? Is Elon Musk self-dealing himself more contracts for radar systems for the military at the expense of a sort of honest process of how you spend taxpayer dollars? We don't know anymore.
Yeah, and we know he's been trying to, right? I mean, let's talk about the Musk of it all. I mean, he spends $290 million to get Trump elected. But then what he's able to do is basically take over the federal government apparatus and take a sledgehammer to it. But really, it's about, once again, lining his own pocket. So first, he goes after every agency that's investigating him, right? And he slashes them. He fires people. He changes all of these investigations, shuts down investigations that were happening. And then what we know is that he is lining in his own pocket with more taxpayer-funded contracts. So just in the last 100 days, his companies have received another $500 million in new federal contracts. By the way, he's gotten over the course of his companies about almost $40 billion in taxpayer-funded contracts, right? And then we see things like, he's trying to end the Federal Aviation Agency's $2.4 billion contract with Verizon so that he can have it instead. Yeah. We saw the Commerce Department make a rule change that actually benefits Starlink and would allow rural broadband, instead of going through the broadband companies like, again, Verizon or Comcast or others, to go through Starlink. He was trying to sell the Department of Defense the Tesla trucks, and only public outrage actually got that pulled back. So what we see is that he is running roughshod over the federal government. He's laid off, he's laying off government workers, and so many thousands and thousands of people are being directly impacted, and so many thousands and thousands of veterans are being directly impacted. And then he's just lining his own pocket.
Yeah, and I'm terrified about what he's doing to train AI agents and other things with all the data that I believe he has stolen. I don't know that, but he certainly has given himself and his team access to data that is the proprietary and very carefully controlled data of the federal government on each of us.
Yeah, we know that he has had access to, all of our credit and Social Security and all of our most private data with the government and information at the IRS that he shouldn't have had access to. And we don't know what he's doing with all of this data. And many people, he has not been shy about the fact that he is trying to start an AI company or get in the AI business to rival Google and others who have AI. And a lot of people think that he is going to take this data that he's gotten from the government and use it to help with this latest business venture. And it's just pure outright theft.
Yeah. It's just, Teapot Dome, really, seriously. How quaint.
Yeah.
It was reported that Donald Trump had pulled in $239 million for his inauguration. That didn't cost $239 million. Why were people ponying up to give that money, and what happens to it? The probably $150 million that's left.
Right. And what we know, too, is that a whole lot of those. What we saw recently was that, he set new records for the amount that was taken into the inaugural committee. And as we all know, he didn't actually he didn't even remember. It all got moved inside, right? It wasn't even a massive outside event like it normally is. And with all of these companies rushed to fill the inaugural coffers with millions and millions of donations. And what we've seen since then is that those same companies and those same donors are being rewarded in lots of different ways. Some are being appointed to foreign policy positions and ambassadorships. Some companies had their investigations halted by the government. In other cases, they were able to get changes to laws and to regulations that they were looking for. And, the first Trump inaugural committee only raised about $100 million, I think, $107 million.
Yep.
So, I think that, trying to figure out where the rest of that money went and also what they were paying for is really important. The largest contributors this time were the poultry company Pilgrims, a crypto company, Ripple, and then Warren Stevens, who was selected as the ambassador to Britain.
Well, Pilgrim just got its reward. They've stopped this week looking for salmonella.
That's right.
Yep. So enjoy that. Enjoy what that
salmonella in their chicken.
Yep. But we're not going to inspect for it anymore. Nope.
Nope.
Wow.
Nope.
I mean, it is I was going to say it's a new world, but it's not. It's an old world. We've just gotten rid of the new one, and we're back in the the era before government helped people. That's all.
It really is. We have returned to, people talk about the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Gilded Age, where we had, this huge these huge monopolies and essentially, these elite wealthy who were hoarding all of the money and wealth in our country at the expense of everyone else and corrupting our government and buying off our government. And, the people rose up. There was a populist uprising. They rose up, they changed the laws, they broke up monopolies, they instituted the Tillman Act, which actually kept corporate money out of our politics for the next 100 years until Citizens United. And so I try to remember how that ended because it's what we need again today, right?
Well,
and what we need again today is that same uprising.
We sure. I mean, TV is, the stories we tell about the Gilded Age are all these images of all these people in their fancy houses and their lovely lives. We don't tell the stories of the stockyards in Chicago and the workers there who were losing limbs into the food. And I mean, just the terrible lives that were all shattered and lost because of the greed of the owners. Don't want to go back there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I've spent some time in Montana, and if you go to Butte, Montana, you see this really kind of perfect encapsulation of that time when you had the copper kings who forced their workers to work in these horribly dangerous, toxic environments, mining copper to literally wire the entire United States. But between the gross violations of worker safety, the pollution and the environmental cost, and then the sheer amount of money that the copper kings then used to corrupt the legislature and to literally buy U.S. Senate seats. It's like this perfect snapshot of what happens when we have all these things come together. And it's also where the fight back against big money started. It's where kind of the modern day labor movement started. And, so again, I think when we have these moments like what we're in right now, where we see this just obscene wealth and power and corruption, it is going to take those kind of populist uprisings, all of us coming together to force real change.
So in the beginning of this term, Trump says, and J.D. Vance says, we shall not be stopped. We are rolling over anybody who gets in our way. Join us or die, right? And the first to fall in line were, of course, the Republicans in Congress. They just caved and said, well, we're in line. Whatever you want, boss. Yeah. The next to fall were the billionaires who said, what do you want for your inauguration? That's fine. What else do you want? That's fine. Where can I buy that meme coin? Fine. And then, that was bad. But then Paul Weiss fell, and that was terrifying. And then Columbia University fell, and that was terrifying. And he was really on the march. But subsequently, I think that was so terrifying that it woke us up. And so Perkins Coie and Jenner and Block didn't fall. They fought back. And then Harvard fought back. And we had these rallies in cities and towns and rural communities all over America where Americans are starting to fight back. And there's a sense now, I think this week he lost 11 big decisions in courts across the country, arrested a judge. That didn't go well for him. She's out and they won't make that case, and everybody has condemned it, including the most conservative judges. They sent a 2-year-old American citizen to Honduras, and we don't even have the language for this. We say they deported a U.S. citizen. Of course, you can't deport a U.S. citizen. They kidnapped and exiled a U.S. citizen. Hey, right? We're learning a whole new vocabulary to deal with these terrible people. But I think you're right. We are coming together. And it is, I just hope that the left side of the Democratic Party is willing to accept into the tent everyone who wants to join us to save the country.
Yeah, and I think this is what we've seen be effective in other countries who have faced authoritarian threats and a decline in democracy and democratic institutions is that you don't always have to agree on everything. You have to agree on some basic foundational principles and then join forces from there, right? And I think that will allow us to have a coalition that's really big enough to fight back against these threats and against what we're seeing. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, right at the beginning of this term, it felt like there was kind of no end to the people willing to bend the knee and kiss the ring and try to appease as if they could somehow protect themselves from all the bad things that were coming. I think now we are starting to see the massive overreach, the chaos, the uncertainty, the self-dealing, the corruption, and more, both people and institutions are starting to stand together and fight back. And I love that you brought up, Harvard, and you saw, I think it was this week, but time is a meaningless circle, but I think it was earlier this week, you saw 230 universities stand together and say that they would not capitulate. And every Ivy League, I think with the exception of one, was on that list. So you start and no amount of their kind of them saying that they won't impact, they wouldn't actually deport U.S. citizens unless it was an extreme case. You tell me what extreme case was in place for this 2-year-old to be deported while her father was actively petitioning the courts to make sure that she wasn't deported, right? It is mind-blowing what we are seeing. But I do think you are right. Between Wisconsin Supreme Court win, the overperformance in the Florida special elections where we cut that performance in half and overperformed. Cory Booker's amazing stand on the U.S. Senate floor. These universities standing together, these lawyers and legal firms starting to stand together, the Civil Service Society fighting back when there have been threatened attacks on the 501c3 nonprofits across the country. And then, of course, there was the hands-off Social Security protest that you mentioned on April 5th. There were more than 5 million people out across the country. And there's going to be another massive day of action on May 1st, on May Day. And, we are seeing that every single state and all of we will have protests and demonstrations in every single state. So I think people are really fired up. And like I said, I've been out and traveling the country and been to some town halls, and people are showing up and they are saying, tell us what else to do. We are going to keep showing up. We're going to keep fighting for our country, and we're not going to let them win.
Yeah, and the them, I just want to broaden that them. Before you joined me, I was musing about the lies these people tell. This week in 9 states, it is Confederate Heritage Month. Imagine that. 9 governors said April is Confederate Heritage Month. like that heritage isn't vile. Like they pretend it's something that it isn't, right? But during this month, Judge Kavanaugh, yet another case to destroy what's left of the Voting Rights Act. From the bench, he's saying, well, why do we need this? And haven't we aged out of having to worry about race in America? Shouldn't it be illegal to have laws that, protect somebody based on race? And I'm thinking, wow, he's saying that while the guy who appointed him is, erasing Black Americans' history as fast as he possibly can. He had an executive order that actually, of course, his executive orders aren't law. He isn't king, but that would get rid of the Civil Rights Division. I mean, that would get rid of the Civil Rights Act. He turned the Civil Rights Division is now there to defend white men. I mean, this is who they are, right?
Yeah. I mean, they have made that clear since day one as well. The attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion are really about attacks on our civil rights progress. And, you know, I still generally believe that the vast majority of Americans believe that we should fight back against discrimination in our country, and that we should be treating everybody equitably and with fairness and with kindness and compassion. But the laws that they are pushing, the revocation of DEI and attacking institutions that have long fought for civil rights gains, important civil rights gains, their attacks on transgender Americans, all of this is just really, really vile and a step backward. And you're right.
Vile.
We've seen it with it is just vile. It is vile.
I mean,
and
Americans, you and I both, we're out and about. We don't just talk to people who think like we think. I'm sure you talk to people who've been Republicans all their lives, and you're talking conservative communities. People don't want us to treat each other cruelly. They don't. I mean, even if they disagree on one policy or another, Americans aren't like, knee-jerk, cruel people. We just don't think that's a good idea.
I agree. I mean, I'm guessing like you, I know many people who ended up voting for Trump, and I've had some of them reach out and say, wait, he's a racist? And
there's a little buyer's remorse right now.
Yes, there is some buyer's remorse. But I also take it as an opportunity to educate and to say, yes, here is what he is doing, and here is how that hurts people, and here is the actual harms coming from it. And not judging them for a decision that they made, but to your point, opening up the tent and inviting them in to stand for what they already believe, which is that people shouldn't be racist, and people shouldn't be attacking people based on just who they are. But what we see this administration doing is weaponizing those attacks every single day. They are targeting people of color. They are targeting and deporting, people without due process, including 2-year-olds who are U.S. citizens. They are attacking any institution who believes that diversity actually makes us stronger and better. They are attacking history and stripping the Smithsonian of literally our country's history and an accurate portrayal of that history. They're banning books. They're banning so many books. And I don't know. I just find it hard to believe that we're all this. Yeah. I just find it hard to believe we're all that fragile, that a book is going to, be the end of us as Americans if some people choose to read it and some people don't. I just believe we are tougher than that and better than that.
We are. I mean, they may not be, but most of us are.
Most of us are.
It's just mind-boggling to me. And their latest effort is they're bending over backwards to find a way to pay women to have children because they're worried about, oh my gosh, wait a minute, we're going to deport everybody. Who's going to work in America? But they really only want to pay white women to have children. So they're like, how do we do this? And they're twisting themselves into pretzels, and they get asked.
Sorry for the cussing on your show there, Edwin. But if they actually cared about women, they wouldn't be cutting right now the grants that fund domestic violence shelters, domestic violence hotlines, shelters for women and children who have been victims of crime, right? Like that hasn't gotten as much attention, but that is what they just cut this past week. Is they called the victims of crime grants that fund these very critical programs for women who are being abused, for women who are being hurt. They called them wasteful spending. And what they're going to do instead is actually, I don't even know. They made up some thing that they supposedly are going to do. You know, I used to do that work. I used to work in those shelters with women and children who had been victimized. And those shelters save people's lives. Those hotlines save people's lives. And that is what, if you actually cared about women and their safety, you would be doubling down on funding things that we know help prevent violence against women. You would be helping pay or figure out how to address the child care crisis in this country, right? When most people can't afford child care because their work sure doesn't help cover it. They can't miss work, and it is as much or more than your housing cost every single month to just be able to have someone take care of your child. But they don't care about any of that. And they don't care about making sure that children have adequate nutrition. They're cutting those programs. They don't actually care. They just want a talking point and to do something crazy like paying women to have children.
I didn't find a topic you care about, did I?
Earlier, you were like, I'm pausing because my blood is boiling, and I'm like, oops, I just, yeah, you hit on one there, Edwin. You hit on one.
Well, you had a great life doing things that are really important for, communities that need it, whether that's the LGBTQ community or women, or it turns out ordinary Americans who aren't billionaires.
Well, thank you. I actually feel like I feel like that is the through line to my career, which is like I have always tried to stand on the side of people whose voice maybe doesn't get as big of a say in our country, in our society, in our system as it should. People who want other people to sit down or be quiet or go away or just be drowned out and to not have the same kind of self-determination that other people get to have. And so, yes, whether it's my work doing social work back in the day or my work doing gay rights, LGBTQ rights work earlier in my career to everything I do right now, it really is about making sure that everybody has a voice and has power in our country, because that's what a democracy is about.
Yeah, and you're pushing back against bullies and all of that, just all of it. I mean, Citizens United is like the bullies protection bill. I got the money. Yeah. I can drown you out. I can set up my speakers, my big, giant, amplified speakers, the kind that you would put in a stadium, and I can wrap them around you and give my speech while you're trying to talk. That's exactly right. That is.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And, it always just boggles my mind, too, because it's such everybody knows this decision was wrong. Everybody knows it. I mean, you can talk to anyone on the street about, like, if you have more money, should that give you more speech in our electoral system? And they will say it shouldn't, but it does, right? Yeah. Everyone knows how the system actually works. Everyone.
Well, John Roberts likes it that way.
I think so, too. I think I think people are trying to pretend that he doesn't want this level of chaos and that he's worried about his legacy. I think
he should be.
I think I think he should be, but I think his legacy has been quite clear. I think it's going to be that
get rid of voting rights and empower corporations. Period.
That's right. That's right. Yep. His legacy is going to be overturning our freedoms, our personal freedoms like Dobbs, and it's going to be destroying the foundations of our democracy from the Voting Rights Act to Citizens United.
Yeah, but he doesn't want the rule of law to go away. So, because then he has nothing. Then he can't do it anymore. So his own, the Supreme Court has expanded its own power, and Donald Trump is expanding his power, and that's a collision course.
Yes, absolutely.
So this week I'm going to root for the Supreme Court. Yeah. Anyway, it is fabulous to talk to you. I love our conversations, and I love the fight that you are in. It's so important, and thank you for doing it.
We're going to keep fighting, and to all your listeners, thanks for being in the fight, and thanks for getting riled up with me on a Saturday afternoon. I always need it, and I look forward to the next time we get to have a long conversation.
Take care, Tiffany.
All right, talk soon. Bye.
Bye. All right, everybody. That was Tiffany Muller, who runs End Citizens United. She's fabulous. We're going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, I caught up with Jonathan Katz from the Brookings Institution yesterday, and I'm going to bring you that interview as soon as we get back.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody. I'm delighted that Jonathan Katz has joined us again. He is the Senior Director for the Anti-Corruption, Democracy, and Security Project in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute. He co-authored the enormously important and very timely 2025 Democracy Playbook. He is well known and respected in the anti-corruption and national security worlds. His career was at the State Department and USAID, and he worked on the Hill. I had the pleasure of sitting down with him in person earlier this week, and so I can add to that bio that he's also a very thoughtful and decent man. John, welcome back.
Thank you. And it was good to see you earlier this week.
Yeah. Hey, in January, you co-authored and you released the Democracy Playbook. In a normal world, I guess that would be a report about post-Soviet nations trying to transform themselves into more democratic societies. But this isn't a normal world, and your report is about us. You identified pillars that needed defending, and I wonder if you'd talk about those pillars and how that defense is going.
Yeah, thank you again. It's good to be back again, and also I think this picks up on our last conversation as well. We wanted to track these key pillars, and we had 7: protecting elections, defending rule of law, fighting corruption, protecting pluralistic governance, reinforcing civic and media space, countering disinformation, and demonstrating that democracy delivers. We anticipated some of the things that have occurred with the new administration and wanted to both track and monitor, whether or not we were seeing any types of erosion in these areas. And, of course, unfortunately, there's been tremendous amount of erosion, and through our research and engagement with democracy actors, and that includes on the government side to civil society to private sector, we've seen this tremendous erosion and a number of the pillars, including the protection of elections. Of course, there was a pretty important court victory yesterday that largely puts a hold on any of one of President Trump's executive orders that we thought would undermine American elections, something that we wrote about on our team, and concerns about unprecedented expansion of executive power, and also debunking claims of voter fraud and disfranchisement of voters. But it's not just the elections piece that we've seen tremendous erosion. It's really the defense of rule of law and the fight against corruption, the weaponization of government that we've seen. The corruption piece alone is incredibly alarming when we think about the guardrails that this administration, unfortunately, is eroding, the type of guardrails, whether we're talking about foreign bribery or pulling down key parts of the U.S. government that prevent things like transnational criminals from using the U.S. financial system to their advantage, or somebody like Vladimir Putin and oligarchs globally. So all of these erosions that we see have a direct impact on the American public, our security, our economy. And I think those erosions are happening. And then on the flip side, I'm happy to talk about what we do see are, as we suggested in the Democracy Playbook and others have as well, is that you're seeing courage and a response to these breakdowns that are critically important from the litigation perspective to citizens and wider set of groups that are starting to act and push back. But there's a lot more that needs to happen to ensure our democracy remains in place and that our economy isn't crippled by actions or our security by the actions being taken.
Well, that's a sort of depressing start, but I want to stay there, I guess, before we talk about the fight back. Let's just take one example recently. So Donald Trump has this meme coin, this crypto venture of his, and he hangs out a sign that says, "Pour money into my crypto wallet. Pay me personally," which is what that is, not the government, "and you can come dine with me in the White House." This is selling access, selling it for personal gain in the White House. And I don't know that there is, it should be illegal. It used to be illegal. My fellow alderman in Chicago went to jail for, similar, less creative, but similar kinds of behaviors. What are we supposed to think about all of this, and what are we supposed to do about it?
Yeah, and that was, underlying the fears in our, as we talked about the corruption risk growing, was in essence hanging a for sale sign at the White House when you can park a Tesla on the front lawn. And the president, it's not the first time, the last administration, when his first term, there was deep concerns about that type of abuse of power and personal financial gain. And it's not out of the realm at the end of this administration that the Trump family might be the wealthiest family in the world. And so when you start to remove, and it's not just on the crypto piece to this, that's one piece to this, but it's about the internal infrastructure that safeguards, that attempts to ensure that U.S. officials are not aggrandized by the work that they're doing, and that their families are not at the same time. And so when you remove inspector generals from key departments and agencies in the United States, when the Department of Justice becomes nothing more, as he says, Trump says that I control the Department of Justice, when it becomes a tool for the president, that is very difficult to find a way to hold the president accountable when there are no bodies, including on the executive side, that are willing to hold the president accountable, including the U.S. Congress. And this is a very important place where Congress in the past has investigated this type of corruption and can play an important role along with the courts. And so I think, unfortunately, based on our research and what we're seeing, is that we're seeing the disbandment of anti-corruption bodies, limited enforcement of existing laws, anti-corruption laws, and that will have, a negative impact on Americans, while Trump is reaping the benefit in his family and those around him from what's taken place. And I think we'll look back at this period and, I hope, as we're thinking through, how do you put in place stronger and stricter safeguards to ensure that the president or any elected official isn't self-serving. And of course, we have high-profile cases, including from the previous Congress of Senator Menendez and others who were held accountable for bad behavior, for corruption. And I think those laws need to apply to the president, regardless of whether he thinks he has immunity and absolute pardon power, which are challenges that really, in many ways make it more difficult now to hold someone like President Trump accountable for his actions in the White House.
Yeah, and the horrific Citizens United decision means that Congress is unlikely to hold him accountable because his billionaires can just dump unlimited amounts of money into the primaries.
Yeah, but can I, Edwin, just on that too? I think just because of Citizens United, I think the examples of what's happening now means that we have to go back into that mode of not only should you be diagnosing the problems, but we need to be thinking about what the solutions are, including whether we talk about political corruption and Elon Musk pouring $290 million into Trump's campaign and then overseeing the dismantling of government and while he's procuring government contracts, so ultimate forms of corruption or pay for play. And that's what we're also thinking hard about, along with other partners, is how are you going to respond? What are the solutions to these challenges? And that means going back in and sort of fighting the fight on Citizens United legislatively. And I do think there may be the opportunity to a reimagined governance and government, because it won't be put back in the same form that it was 3 or 4 months ago.
Let me pause you on that thought, because I want to end with what a Project 2029 would look like. So we'll come back to that in a minute. You just released or about to release a report on higher ed. So we have this. We've just talked about how corrupt the government is, and how the guideposts that would help us see it and stop it are eroded. Now they're attacking civil society all over the place, including higher ed. And I think that's something that you've focused on as well. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. In many ways, it's been, when we look, as you mentioned at the top, I've spent much of my career focused on autocracies globally. And we have, as part of our research, taken a look at examples globally and applying it domestically, what we're seeing in the United States, meaning that the playbook that President Trump and his administration are using to target specific groups or sectors or political opponents is something it's not new. The speed of which it's happening in the U.S. is much faster. The speed of these attacks on these groups is happening more quickly here than we have seen in other countries globally, where you have similar decline of democracy and a rise to power of a strong man. Now, some may argue that Trump is more mafia than he is authoritarian, but it's hard to really say the outcome of what they're trying to do. Their efforts are quite similar. And American higher education is of deep concern, of course. What we point out and sort of thinking about this is how important are these institutions in the United States, both economically, for students, for our future, for our democracy, our security and economy. And then we have been diagnosing and looking at really what we believe is an unprecedented effort to target, intimidate, and exert greater control over U.S. higher education institutions by this administration in just 3 months. And these threats in of themselves are problematic because they are attacks on free speech, academic freedom, as we see it. And we're not alone. There's a broad-based group, both on the university and higher education side, colleges, public and private, and then a cross-sector of whether it's unions, whether it's legislators, and the public sector that are all speaking out with concerns about the importance of safeguarding academic freedom and free expression. So we are really highlighting that and pointing out. And, of course, the decision by Harvard to push back for many is important because it highlights that universities need to and can stand up to the administration, and we're seeing a banding together of universities and higher education in response. And in our research, that big tent coalition pushback is particularly important and much more effective at thwarting or pushing back against authoritarian tendencies. And so I think you're seeing, we started off on a sour note, but what you're actually seeing is this democracy actor space starting to expand. And you're seeing this in the town hall meetings, of course, that some legislators don't want to go to, because the concerns of the American public, whether it's economic or services, whether it deals with freezing of funding, and of course, if you are in a community where there's a university or public or private that is receiving federal government funding for research, that money, those resources trickle down to the entire community where that funding is taking place, not even withstanding the critical scientific research that is taking place that benefits the American public and others globally.
The whole world.
When you start to do that, and so we're really, I think we believe that this is a particularly important sector to focus on, and what we're seeing in terms of diagnosing how it is moving forward and expanding its coalitions to engage on this issue, it's particularly important as democracy actors think about how they can push back against erosions.
Yeah, I was proud of Harvard for that. I was, and I agree with you that we are beginning to see these larger groups form, but people don't want to be alone in this fight, and we're seeing these groups. I'm even beginning to see it in the legal profession after the terrifying collapse of Paul Weiss and Skadden. So I agree with you. It's enormously important, and we're beginning to see it. I want to ask you a question about the speed that's happening in the United States as opposed to the speed that these attacks happened in other countries. And I wonder, do you think that it moved slower in Turkey, in Poland, in Hungary, in even from the left in Mexico, in part because the United States was a strong voice for democracy and in effect slowed them down because we were standing on the other side? And now that the United States, the president of the United States, has himself engaged in these attacks, I kind of think you will see in the rest of the world an acceleration of this autocracy. What do you think?
I think there's a couple things to unpack. One is on the U.S. side. Certainly, there is part of the strategy of the administration was to move quite quickly, and you are seeing this largely through executive orders, many of which courts have pushed back on, and it is meant to be a fear and intimidation tactic, and it has had some success at chilling responses. Some point to Colombia as or law firms that have signed off on deals with the administration, or recently CBS, for example, some of their leading journalists resigned, saying we're not going to compromise, my integrity based on sort of the deal that was being struck. So the shock and awe tactic is something that we pointed to right away in our democracy playbook. We knew this was coming. I think the pieces that people didn't anticipate is a Congress that was unwilling to necessarily stand up, including on funding freezes, things that were this congressional prerogative that Congress has not pushed back, and that that sectors would be divided quickly and individually targeted as part of a strategy, and that was problematic. And of course, globally, this does have an impact, and you see it already in countries where you have authoritarian governments or democratic backsliding, where they look at what's happening in the United States, and you can already see on the ground how, whether it's in Georgia or Hungary under Viktor Orban, where they're taking advantage of sort of where this administration, how they're approaching certain issues, whether it's diversity and inclusion, LGBTQ, or we're talking about rule of law, taking advantage of the United States withdrawn from its role as a leader, a global leader in advancing democracy, including assistance globally, to the leading provider of democracy assistance globally. Stepping back has ramifications for democracy actors around the globe. and it has weakened those networks and emboldened other authoritarians to step into the gap where the U.S. has led. And what is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to less good governance, growing inequality in these spaces, increased levels of corruption, and also threats to the United States, because many of the challenges that the U.S. faces are transnational as well, including in terms of security and economics, and that is a problem for the U.S. So if you don't have foresight in that area, it is deeply problematic, and the U.S. pullback, which is unprecedented compared to any Republican or Democratic president, is something that really needs focus. So it's not a nice to have in this space. The U.S. has to be a leader, or it sacrifices its own self-interest.
Yeah, I mean, I was an election monitor decades ago in the first election in the country of Paraguay after the dictator Alfredo Stroessner had died and they were making a transition. And, it was not a perfect election, but the people that I met everywhere in the country were so grateful that an American-led delegation was there to help them monitor and think through how to run elections. And just that kind of thing is important, and our government has walked away entirely from that.
Yeah, and like you, I've had an opportunity to serve as an election observer. Yep. The last time was President Zelensky's election.
Wow.
The last presidential election in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And sort of how consequential that was, and both from the U.S. side and OSCE and other election monitors was a clean and fair election. Yep. It really highlighted how Ukraine had transitioned, and due to a large part because of U.S. support following the collapse of the Soviet Union, sticking with Ukrainians for 3 decades. Yeah. Helping Ukrainian civil society build out and through some very difficult times. So the investment in democracy is usually nothing compared to the level of funding we have in the democracy, in the defense and security side. But the U.S. has been able to walk and chew gum at the same time, which means having security and defense relations, diplomatic relations, and then development and democracy support globally. And let's not forget the institutions, independent institutions like National Democratic Institute and IRI. These institutions, Freedom House and others, that had also been part of this, NED and others, have all been largely
destroyed.
In just in 3 months. So there's that impact as well, and sort of a rollback of U.S. leadership.
Yep. Soft power is important, and on the hard power side with Mr. Hegseth, there's certainly chaos in the Defense Department now. So I don't know anything they're doing right. I just can't find it. All right, well, let's talk about how we go forward. This envisioning of a world post this. And let's assume for a moment that we succeed in stopping Donald Trump from becoming president for life, and his party, his MAGA party, being like the CCP and ruling forever, but that we somehow retain our democracy or restore our democracy. What do we do then to move us forward?
Yeah, I think that it's a little bit, there's sort of 10-step process. Where sort of number one, which is to admit that the system that's been in place is wasn't working, didn't work for many Americans, and I think there's an admission that in order to come back, that it's not simply about going back in and reverse engineering Project 2025, which was the playbook used by and continues to be used by this administration to really tear down government and to put in place something that lacked the safeguards that are necessary for good governance and responsibility to both Americans, taxpayer dollars, all the things that we care about. We're thinking very much about like you would in terms of a transition, presidential transition. We don't know what will happen, but the planning that needs to take place has to take into account the failures, the weaknesses within the system. So how to rebuild checks and balances that have eroded? How do we reform and deal with a Congress that is in many ways abdicated its responsibility to play the role that it needs to play? And I think that erosion has steadily been happening for the last 2 decades. And how do we strengthen the judiciary as well? Those checks and balances, the Constitution, these things were put in place to prevent someone like Mr. Trump from doing what he is doing today. It's clear that didn't happen. But at the same time, you cannot, our seventh pillar is demonstrating that democracy delivers. And that means there's an economic component to any type in parallel with the current, need to go back in, we can call it transition 2029 or whatever, but I don't think we necessarily need to do that. But there needs to be an economic component to this, as we point out to in our playbook, because many Americans feel not only left behind by the economy, and of course, many who are going to be advocating for a new form of government need to do much better job of engaging from rural communities to urban to really make certain that Americans they're on board with these changes. And Brookings will be pulling together as part of our project. It's not only the response and sort of analysis on the current breakdown, but it's more about how we look ahead to reform and really build out the type of coalitions that are committed, a new civic agreement that really will forge a different type of bond with the voters in the country and Americans and governance going forward. And that's broken. And that includes the counter disinformation and the civic and media space, which we know is incredibly difficult to break through to certain voters in the U.S. About what's happening, how it impacts them. And I think if we fail on the communications piece of whatever those that want good governance, want a strong democratic America, want the U.S. to be an economic and global leader that addresses the challenges of the public, we have to do a much better job at finding ways to communicate in a fractured media, and one in which President Trump and his allies have done quite well over the past several years at building out and presenting a very different future and perspective of America.
Yeah. Well, one of the consequences of this idea that you're talking about is something that every voter in the next election cycle has to keep in mind. In the past, we voted people because we thought they would push for one policy or another, or they have my back. This time we have to look for people like Madison. We have to look for people who also, in addition to whatever other reason you send them to government, are able to think about the structure of government, are able to think about how we strengthen the institutions or redesign some of the institutions of our democracy to meet the challenges that we face now, not the ones we faced a couple hundred years ago. It's a really big challenge for folks running for office right now and for voters.
Yeah, and I think you can see that in polling numbers. We highlight those the support for democracy, which is a large percentage, both on the Republican and Democratic side, both want to and support democracy. But the view of democracy and what that looks like is very different. And as someone who's worked on campaigns and has been at that sort of nexus of engagement directly with constituencies, the grassroots level, there's got to be differences, but we have to find common language, including on things like rule of law, corruption, democracy, what governance looks like, but we're dealing with the reality of a very difficult media and communications period, and that's going to require a stronger effort by all these actors. And I'm really, one thing we talked about maybe more in the glass half empty, but you really do see, and you're starting to see cross-sectoral support and engagement with each other across the U.S., a rising number both of protests, but groups from veterans to labor unions to university students and others that are coming together. And it, even in some darkness, we're seeing some light and we're seeing courage. And it's going to require courage and a lot of hard work to get us to a better place.
That is going to have to be our last word, John. Thank you so much. Listen, everybody, go on the Brookings website, look up, they have a section on democracy, and look at it. You'll see some really interesting stuff, and follow their work because it's going to just help us get out of this mess we're in. Jonathan Katz, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's good to speak to you.
Yep. Take care.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. My next guest, it's her first time on the show with us, and I've wanted to talk to Renee DiResta for a long time. She's an associate professor at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. She studies the way people communicate online, and by communicate, I guess I mean manipulate, harass, and target other people online. Her work stands at one of the most important and dangerous intersections that there is. It's the one where influencers, algorithms, and sort of crowds of online people get together. And that's the intersection through which our democracy must safely cross. She's the author of a fabulous book, Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. And she's written for, lots of publications, Wired, Foreign Affairs, the Columbia Journalism Review, the New York Times, other, slouchy places like that. Renee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I guess one of the things that I would love you to explain to all of us is MAGA's finger pointing at the rest of the world about censorship. They want to just scream from while they're banning books and doing all the things that they do, they want to scream that everybody else is a censor. What's going on? What is that?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So there's a couple things that are happening there. First, starting in around 2017, that became a really effective strategy for reframing content moderation, which is how social media platforms decide how to handle the posts that people put on their platforms as there are a bunch of different ways that they can do it. They can remove content, they can reduce its distribution, or they can contextualize it, like by putting a label, maybe a fact check, or a go here to get more information. So when social media companies decided that they were going to try to address certain types of either harassment content or false or misleading content or politically manipulative content, when they began to do that, some of the people who were getting either fact-checked or labeled or downranked included, starting in around 2017, the President of the United States himself. And so one of the things that MAGA began to do, that the President himself began to do, in fact, was to reframe content moderation as censorship. And this started long before COVID. It started long before election 2020. And they began to say that putting any kind of label or any kind of fact check or any kind of reduced distribution on any kind of conservative speech in particular was an act of censorship, that the platforms, rather than trying to exercise their own First Amendment rights, because the platforms legally have their own First Amendment rights to moderate and decide what shows up on their platforms and how, that in fact, by moderating content on their platforms, the platforms were censoring people. So this really began to heat up, really kind of picked up with a vengeance around 2020. And that's because the president of the United States at the time was Donald Trump, and he began to allege that the 2020 election was going to be stolen. And this was long before Election Day. This was in the early summer leading into the campaign. He began to allege things like that mail-in balloting was fraudulent. And the platforms decided to create a policy that if you said such things, your content was going to be labeled, it was potentially going to be downranked, and they were going to take action about things like that. And they did. And this led to just, massive amounts of outrage in which these, both the president and influencers who were aligned with him, who had very loud voices, who were not actually censored at all, began to allege that these moderation actions that were taking place, particularly around content related to the election, were in fact acts of censorship. And they did a very good job running a propaganda campaign to reframe the platforms exercising their First Amendment rights to moderate their content as acts of censorship. Now, there are times when governments do overstep their, where governments do reach out to platforms and say, hey, you should take this down, right? And that is at times actually an act of government, saying, hey, we want this content taken down. Turkey does it. You'll see India will do it periodically. Governments do, in fact, try to censor content. China doesn't really engage with U.S.
They don't allow it in the first
place. They don't allow it in the first place, exactly. There are times when, when the Biden administration would periodically reach out and be a little bit forceful, right? Hey, we really kind of want to see this taken down. So there are times when governments do reach out, and sometimes they're explicit about it. You will take this down, right? And that is censorship. Sometimes they're a little bit, hey, it'd be really great if this came down. And there are legal lines around what constitutes coercion and what doesn't. We haven't really seen a court case really adjudicate that. So these are things where, as citizens, we really don't want our government in the United States doing that. But the American right wing managed to redefine all acts of moderation as censorship. And it didn't do it because there was actual censorship taking place. It did it as part of a political campaign to delegitimize moderation in order to advantage itself politically. And that's what you have to understand. So there are very legitimate reasons why we as American citizens should want to make sure that our government is not reaching out to tech companies and trying to have content taken down behind our backs. That is a very real thing that we should want to understand and make sure is not happening. We should want to have transparency laws passed to ensure that that is not happening. But that is not what the Trump campaign was upset about. They were upset about the fact that their lies were being labeled, and so they set out on an undertaking to delegitimize the very enterprise of content moderation.
Okay, thank you for that. That is enormously helpful. So here we have the MAGA world saying anybody who calls me a liar is guilty of censorship, and we're going to stop them from doing it. At the same time, they're free to re-edit, take down, whatever they want because they are. I mean, Harriet Tubman doesn't exist on the national park websites anymore. Right? They can do whatever they want this way, and it's not censorship. They can burn books. It's not censorship.
This is the sort of hollow hypocrisy at the center of a lot of what's happening. The challenge is that you assume that when you point out hypocrisy, the person that you're pointing it out to cares that they're being called a hypocrite, and as we've seen, unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, I actually think that it is. I've thought a lot about their lying, and actually, you're a great person to ask. I think the lying is a form of MAGA group virtue signaling. That if they don't lie because they think we're going to be fooled. They just know that if they're willing to stand up, and the bigger the lie they're willing to tell the mainstream media and the rest of America, the more they're telling others in MAGA, hey, I've got your back.
I mean, that is something that you do see happen in, in authoritarian and in fascist political allegiances, right? Where the community comes together around the belief in the lie. Yes, that is something that happens. I think what you're seeing here is a political movement that has taken power, that is reshaping governance in the way that it wants to, and that includes prioritizing and deprioritizing information, in the way that it has rather clearly telegraphed that it was going to. So I think what we're seeing here is it was very clearly articulated, and it is not surprising.
Well, so you used the word reframing before. They were able to reframe content moderation as censorship. MAGA and Trump in particular, they're very good at this reframing thing. And I assume, like you, I am often deeply frustrated when folks on my side fall into every trap the MAGA crowd lays before them. Is it so hard not to have reality reframed out from under you? Is it so hard to stand on your values and talk about the good you're doing? Can't anybody respond to MAGA without using MAGA talking points?
I think it requires, so for people who are not familiar with the term, framing is just how you choose to present an idea, right? And when you're framing something, it's deciding what you're going to emphasize and what you're going to downplay. So you can take the same set of facts and you're choosing what you're going to emphasize and what you're not going to emphasize. And what that means is you're not necessarily lying, right? You're using the same facts. It's just shifting the focus. So you can highlight a particular number and you can choose for example, a statistic, and you can talk up the statistic. I'll use a specific example here because my work became the focus of a MAGA conspiracy theory, alleging that I had, helped contribute to stealing the 2020 election. And one of the things that they did was they took a number, 22 million tweets, that my colleagues and I had actually written down on paper, right? It came out of a real report that we had written, where after the election, we had added up the number of tweets, the most viral rumors in the 2020 election, things like Dominion voting machines being rigged or Sharpie markers making ballots unreadable in Arizona. And after the election, we had added up the number of tweets in all those stories, and the number was 22 million. And so that number did appear in a report that we wrote. Well, some of the liars who wanted to reframe our work as a vast censorship campaign took that number and they said they censored 22 million tweets. They said that 22 million tweets were misinformation. And that's not exactly what happened, right? We did say that 22 million tweets were misinformation, kind of. I mean, that's not exactly what we said, We said that 22 million viral tweets were part of viral rumors about misinformation in the 2020 election. So that's kind of how we had said it, but we certainly didn't say that we had labeled them as misinformation. They were certainly not censored. We certainly hadn't done the censoring. But, when you have to explain all of the different things that had actually happened versus not happened, then you're really bogged down in explaining the truth of that 22 million number, that 22 million statistic. And it just took me probably 45 seconds to explain that one statistic, right? So the reframing of one number essentially bogs down the target in having to say, well, yes, 22 million appears in our report, but no, not the way that you're saying it does, right? And that's how it's done. So you take a number or you take something, you decontextualize it, you completely recontextualize it, you lie about it, you move it into another context entirely.
Yep.
Exactly. And when you do that, you put your adversary, in a sense, on the back foot. Because the person who you're arguing with usually feels some sort of desire to be a good faith, to be in conversation in good faith. Well, let me explain. What you're doing here is you're trying to lie using the statistic. And so instead they feel like rather than calling out the reframing, explaining how that propaganda tactic works, explaining what the adversary is doing, they get bogged down in trying to explain the truth and the details. And that's where the reframing tactic works time and time and time again.
Okay. Live radio, there's still some words we can't say.
Sorry.
And that is censorship by the government, but that it is what it is.
So we use that term in academia.
Yeah.
To mean information.
These days I hear it a lot on this show. It's hard. It's just hard not to have that happen. So look, they've put truth in the witness protection program. It's like hiding somewhere and you can't find it. And I begin to think, now I'm just going to shift the subject a little bit. I think people, I think a lot about how people know the things they know. And it isn't because they really know. Like, I get on an airplane. I'm not a physicist. I can't really tell you why that hunk of metal doesn't fall out of the sky. But I know it's not going. I'm comfortable that it isn't going to. I think I know why a heavy metal boat doesn't sink into the ocean, but I bet you there are people who get on those boats and they don't have any idea why it doesn't sink. They're happy to do it. We get a lot of knowledge socially. We accept it. Humans always have, right? So in some ways, in really frightening ways, truth is your social media feed. It is the stuff you're being fed all day long. And while these guys are complaining about some information being deprioritized on social media, the owners of these platforms are prioritizing their own lies. I mean, look at how many of the tweets on X are actually Elon Musk's. His reach is almost everywhere, right? This gets at your book, at the idea that they're inventing a truth for all of us. Talk about that.
So one of the things that happens on a social media platform is that the person who controls the platform decides how the content is curated. And one of the things that happens on most mainstream social platforms, on X, on Meta properties, is that it's curated in a way that tries to keep the users on site. So they want to keep you there. They want to show you ads, right? And so they're showing you things that are sensational, that are engaging. And unfortunately, oftentimes, that's stuff that is, not necessarily what you might, if you had to write down, or if you were kind of looking at yourself in the mirror, like thinking, I am the kind of person who likes, and then making a list for yourself, you would maybe say, you'd have like lofty ideas about the kind of content you like, your self-perception, versus the things that you actually click on, or the things that it pushes to you, and you just find yourself scrolling down the vertical scroll, and then you find yourself after half an hour wondering, what did you spend all that time on? And that's because it's really there, and it's really designed to engage you and keep you scrolling. There are platforms now that are trying to give users a little bit more control. And those are platforms like Blue Sky, where you can select a feed to follow. But what's interesting is a lot of users don't even know that that's possible. So they go to Blue Sky and they still just kind of stick with the default. You can, the thing that I've been really interested in as a person who studies social media is when you tell people, I was in we had a lab meeting in Georgetown yesterday, and I was kind of talking to people in my lab, saying, just kind of walking through some cool stuff that I'd been looking at. And I asked people, like, hey, how many people are actually on different feeds on Blue Sky? And it was still only maybe 20% of the people in the room. So even people who are very informed and connected don't really think, hey, I can actually go and do this for myself, right? I can actually say, I am going to select 5 feeds, and I'm actually going to make one news, right? I'm actually going to make one science. I'm going to make one, I have one for gardening, right?
Right.
I can actually empower myself to find these things. And that's because we're also used to just abdicating that responsibility, right? Somebody else is going to curate it for me. I'm going to sit there and I'm just going to follow it. And that's because it's easy and it's engaging and we're going to do it. But then you also talk to people and they're constantly expressing, and you see this in polling all the time now, yeah, I still use these platforms, but I don't really feel good about it afterwards. So I think we're at this inflection point where the technology exists now where you don't have to be in that mindset where you use it and then you kind of wish you hadn't after. But you do have to be willing to get yourself into a different place. Yeah, do a little extra work. I mean, Reddit is another place where you don't necessarily have to do the hard work of, like, you know, figuring out how to subscribe to a different feed. You can just go, you know, join a bunch of different subreddits and it'll still curate the feed for you. But you can go and you can subscribe to things based on your interests. And you can actually, like, feel like you're having a more affirmative experience of saying, like, I want to see this. Like, I want to spend my time in a much more conscious way.
That's so interesting. So let's talk about Section 230 and the argument that changing the rules for these platforms. First, if you tell people what that's about and what the controversy is.
Well, I mean, the controversy varies depending on which legislative cycle you're in. I'm a little bit of a 230 change skeptic, only because it's been the topic of conversation for over a decade now and nothing has happened. So the argument, so CDA 230 is the law that gives platforms the right to moderate, again, as they see fit. So when I said that the platforms get to decide what to remove, reduce, and inform, you know, so when they choose to set their policies, they are making that determination. And they can choose not to moderate anything at all if they want to. Short of illegal content, there are certain things that are explicitly illegal, right? Child exploitation content is illegal. They must address that. But there are other areas like there are definitions of hate speech or hateful conduct, for example. They have a lot of carte blanche there, a lot of, you know, ways to decide how they're going to handle it. Same thing with, you know, mis or disinformation policies, spam, scams, you know. They have a lot of discretion. But what you see happen is that it becomes very politicized. And this is because politicians on the left for many years wanted to see them be more strict with trying to have more harmful content come down. And politicians on the right wanted to see the scales tilted more in favor of letting more content stay up. And depending on what party is in power, you see that kind of what we call working the referees. Those sort of appeals to the platform to shift the policies in a way that might favor one political party or another, kind of tilting back and forth. And that is the, you know, the sort of dynamic that takes shape. I see. You know, I know that
what about the algorithms
excellent
themselves?
Policy folks. Well, I mean, the algorithms themselves are controlled by the companies, and so you do occasionally see efforts at passing, you know, efforts to introduce legislation to make CDA 230 protections contingent upon a, you know, like for example, transparency or moderating certain content in certain ways. But this requires actual legislation to pass in the United States of America, in the U.S. Congress. So right now, this is the most likely it's been in a long time, but that's because the Republicans control both houses and the executive branch. And even there, I haven't seen any strong momentum to rush anything through. So what you're actually going to see happen, what's going to be much more likely, is that the Europeans have laws that are in effect now, the Digital Services Act and other things, that require platforms to have transparency, disclosures, to have data access provisions, to moderate in the European Union in particular ways. This is why J.D. Vance, Vice President Vance, is making particular statements about
he's furious that anybody would moderate Nazi content in Germany. Yeah, it's outrageous.
Right, and that's in part what this is a reflection of is the Europeans regulating American tech companies in European markets, and so that rhetoric is kicking up. Yeah, I mean, and that is so. Now what we're going to see is how much the Europeans are going to enforce their own laws in light of the administration change. We're going to see what that enforcement looks like and how much they fight, and then the ways in which some of the transparency and data access kind of trickle down effects will shape what Americans can see, meaning that a lot of the data access provisions, just so that American researchers could see what was happening on these American platforms, were revoked just because, X decided to make it cost $40,000 a month for researchers to study what was happening on X, whereas now the European laws are in effect that provide some access to that data. So you're going to see a little bit of
he's charging you for data to do your research while he's harvesting all of government's data to train his AIs.
Yeah, I mean, again, the pointing out the hypocrisy doesn't have the effect you kind of hope it would, but yes.
Well, it's not going to change their behavior. We're past that. I think the facts are clear. What's your best counsel? We don't have so little time left. What's your best counsel for Americans on how they can preserve their sanity and protect themselves from the worst propaganda that's out there, or the deluge of propaganda that's out there?
I think it's really a matter of just being cognizant of what you're and what you're engaging with, not from the standpoint of implying that you're going to magically be able to avoid it. Right? Propaganda is everywhere; it surrounds us constantly. It's more of the I think just being attuned to things like framing, right? Why is this information presented in this way? What am I seeing? The sort of cui bono, right? Who benefits from this? And even when you're seeing it on social media, you're not going to be exempt from it. There is no one political party that holds a monopoly on propagandist media, right? Understanding that it is just a matter of presenting information with a particular agenda and just being attuned to the rhetoric and the style of presentation. Is this making me outraged for some reason? If so, why? How can I control my response to that? If this makes me very, very angry, that's usually the content that I go and fact check, right? If this is something that I find absolutely outrageous, those are the stories that I go check, and there's a lot of that lately.
Yeah, there's a lot of it. And a lot of it turns out to be true.
A lot of it does turn out to be true, right? You see stories about 2-year-olds being deported, and you think, no way is that true? And then it turns out, yes, in fact, that one is. But there is still that moment, I think, where you do take the extra beat just to go see, is there a primary source on that? Has somebody else corroborated it? Where is it? Can I at least take the extra 30 seconds before sharing it? And I think that actually really is very important because I think it's just good practice to do that, because sometimes it's not going to be true.
There you are. Can you hear me?
Now I can. Yes, I lost you there for a second.
Well, my fault. I was just saying, and I don't know where you lost me, but you sound like Socrates. You're complaining about the sophists, right? The democracies they're people who manipulate through rhetoric, whether that's online or in speech, and critical thinking and asking important questions is the best defense we have.
It's funny you say that. I actually personally have really enjoyed some of the people who put out the Daily Stoic content and things like that. I know it's not for everybody, but there are the folks like, Ryan Holiday and others who have just that reminder that, the world maybe doesn't need a response from me or you in this particular moment on this particular thing. I can just sit back and observe.
Yep.
So deciding when to respond is key.
Your work is important, and when you do respond, and I look at your social media, I enjoy it immensely. Thank you for being out there and being part of arguing for, I don't know, truth is, I guess, not the right word, but arguing that we don't get fooled all the time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, everybody, we're going to take a break for the news, and when we come back, you're going to hear from someone we talked to last, right before the November election. You're going to want to hear what Donna Ladd has to say.
You're looking at the big picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Donna Ladd is the founder, executive director, and editor of the Mississippi Free Press, as well as the Jackson Free Press. Some of you will remember, she and I last spoke on this show right before the November election, right before that disaster. I wanted at the time for you to hear from, someone in a red state that most of the media, paid no attention to, but who really deserves the country's attention and respect. And boy, we need to pay attention now. Donna, welcome back.
Thank you.
Hey, April is almost over. And so I wanted to talk to you because in your state, the governor proclaimed April Confederate Heritage Month. That's a thing, I guess, that they've done every April since the 1990s, and a bunch of other former Confederate states have followed suit. And I kind of think the rest of us should talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think so, too. That's the reason we do that coverage.
Yeah, and the coverage was great. So tell everybody first, what is the governor and what do advocates of Confederate heritage, whether for a month or more generally, think that heritage is?
Well, I think it depends. I don't think you can just have a blanket answer to that, really. But I think it goes from pretty extremist to really extremist in many ways. And what I mean by that is I think that there are certainly people who, and not in just in Mississippi or the South, across the country as we're seeing now, who would like us to go back to the practices of the Confederacy, and particularly the treatment of Black people as not even human beings, right? So there are people, I think, who are still angry in their own way that that the South lost the Civil War, and that the goals of the Confederacy weren't played out, which was, as I'm sure you know, to continue slavery, but also to extend it to new states and force those states to have slavery, to get runaway enslaved people, to require them to be returned. It was just this whole slate of things that was about Black oppression. So certainly there are people that I believe would fit into that category. But I also think that it's been used, I know that it's been used as a very divisive kind of wedge kind of issue for decades now. And so the people who I think would say that they for one thing, they don't want to believe that the Confederacy was about slavery. I mean, they will argue to their blue in the face with you and have with me many times that the Confederacy was a war. Well, they'll call it Northern aggression, but it was also a war to, force war over power, a war over money. And what I would say to that is that there is truth in all of that, and which is, I think, is important to say out loud. It wasn't like the North was angelic throughout this period of time, but the truth is, as I've said many times, the South was fighting the war over slavery and to keep it going. And so they use it as a symbol of states' rights to make their own decisions without federal control, which is ironic in this moment, I realize. And right. And just as a symbol to, to rile up the masses, of a lot of white people, including people I grew up around in Neshoba County. They fly the flag or they believe in the Confederacy because, they see it as a symbol of worth in some way because they don't want to be the bottom of the barrel. And politicians for generations now have taken advantage of both ignorance and also this desire to feel, not the bottom of the barrel and superior to someone else, and for their own purposes. And that, in many ways, that's what makes me the angriest about it all as a native Southerner.
Well, so let me react to some of what you told me. First, it's not all on the South. When on January 6th, the Confederate battle flag was carried into the U.S. Capitol, it wasn't carried by someone from a Confederate state. This disease has spread all over the country, for sure. But also, I mean, the Confederacy was established explicitly, as you said, to preserve and extend slavery. I think it was Mississippi's own Declaration of Secession in 1861. It said, I wrote this down before we talked, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. So anybody who tells you that's not the heritage they're celebrating this month is lying, no matter what they think.
No, that's right. And read Texas Declaration of Succession because it's almost worse than Mississippi's. I mean, it's just this. Yep. It was so blatant, So yes, you're absolutely right.
But so you point out that the politicians are wanting to distance themselves from the truth of what they're calling Confederate heritage in order to play to a crowd. And boy, that's disgusting. But when Governor Tate Reeves, published his proclamation, I found this fascinating. He didn't actually say it out loud. He had the folks at a place called Beauvoir publish it to tell everybody what that is.
Okay, let me. There's a little factual stuff there. When Phil Bryant, who was governor when I first broke this, because it's very important to understand that until 2016, it was completely under the radar that it was happening, like completely. And for all those years, and media, if any media knew it, they weren't reporting it because the media has been complicit in the state, but that's a different subject. So when I got a tip that Beauvoir had put Governor Bryant's proclamation on their website. So I was on vacation and just spent vacation like putting the story out and dealing with that one of the biggest stories we'd ever done. So that's where it was done then. Okay, so after I exposed that initially, Beauvoir,
wait, I need to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I have to interrupt you for 1 second because the rest of the country doesn't know what Beauvoir is. So just explain why this governor would have a secret proclamation and it would go out on Beauvoir's website.
So Beauvoir is basically the retirement home of Jefferson Davis on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Yeah. And it's been turned into a museum to the Confederacy. And it was also the place where the sons of Confederate veterans and Daughters of the Confederacy set up the cemeteries to bury early on, to bury former Confederates. And, so those cemeteries are still there. So it's a place where people go visit. But it's also the thing about Beauvoir, which gets state funds, is that Beauvoir it's a one big apology for the Confederacy because it's run by the Sons of Confederate Veterans who are very radical, even though they try to pretend they're not. So Beauvoir wants this every year. All of these organizations, like especially the Sons and the Daughters, want this. This is the way they kind of keep their membership going, and it legitimizes their work. So I think in the past, before 2016, they had put it there too, but nobody had really noticed because, only that crowd, for the most part, is going to the Beauvoir website, right? So I discovered that, and then we kind of kept reporting it every year. We put it in context. So to get to Tate Reeves, since he's been in office, he's been putting it out. Oh, by the way, Beauvoir stopped putting it on the website after I had reported about it because it brought too much attention, right? Negative attention. So when Tate Reeves took office, 2019, I think, he started he would put it out, but what he does is he sneaks it out. It's an open secret at this point, but I had to go find it. He sneaks it out onto the Facebook page of the Rankin County Sons of Confederate Veterans chapter. And Rankin County is right here next to Jackson. It's a much wider county where a lot of white flight went. And he grew up in Rankin County. And so he gives it to this chapter of SCV there quietly. They never have put it on the website, at least since I discovered on their official website with their other proclamation.
Good for you.
So it's an open secret. It's the weirdest thing at this point because they know we're going to find it every year and give it attention. But they're not proud of it to the point that they actually put it on the website, which to me is just really strange.
Yeah, I mean, let's be on the governor's website. I just wrote down some of the things he wrote at the top of his own, the official website for Governor Reeves. We must care about each other enough to overcome our differences. We must be faithful to each other enough to outlast our shortcomings. We must be committed to each other enough to raise our expectations. Well, honestly, I mean, if I'm going to speak plainly, you cannot square the idea of overcoming our differences with the idea of celebrating Confederate heritage.
Well, I agree with you, but to speak for them,
yep.
Their argument is that it is honoring, like SCV's talking point on this, is that it's honoring the dead. It's honoring the people from then who fought. Now, I descend, by the way, from a number of Confederate soldiers.
You're not guilty for the sins of your ancestors.
What now?
No one is guilty for the sins of their ancestors.
No. Okay. On that point, I will say you're absolutely right, but I do think we should take responsibility for turning things a different way. If
I agree with that too. Absolutely.
And did these things. And so that's where I come from, is that, I didn't know those guys. Why would I defend them now?
Yep.
Right? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And they are not who I am. My self-esteem and sense of who I am does not rely on defending these guys who fought to force, the Midwest to have slavery. It's just absurd. And so, but I think people need to understand that they have, the propaganda machine around this has been going on since the Civil War ended. It started immediately, the Lost Cause, all of the things, the statues that went up, the textbook censorship, that the president of my university at Mississippi State helped lead. All of these things have been just continual drumbeat. And then there was this reconciliation with Northern Union soldiers that a lot of people don't know that this happened, where white people kind of got all back together again and said, we're just going to let bygones be bygones, and we're going to stop talking about all this.
Yep, so let's get on with making money, and let's let Jim Crow flourish.
Well, that's it. It's like you do your thing, especially after Reconstruction, was forcefully ended. And so, so all this history got buried. That's the point. And so a lot of people I know grew up being taught, lies. and I was too, I just kind of transcended them, but about this history and heritage. And so people now really think, a lot of people, especially the followers, really think that this is something to be proud of. And that, and I beg to differ.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I mean, when I think of going to war to protect the idea of slavery, I hear General Patton in my head saying, I don't want my people dying, for a cause. I want the guy on the other side dying for the cause. I mean, it gets my blood riled all over again. And I didn't live through that, but it feels like we're living through it now because just a week ago, federal funds for what's called the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, and that's that's a place that a former plantation, or I guess slave camp, I guess is a better word for it, that focused on the truth about what happened there, as opposed to the myths, just had its federal funds cut, right? But as you said earlier, Beauvoir is getting state funding, and I think they got a bunch of federal funds after Katrina came through there. So,
I'm sure they did, to preserve the, because it was hit hard. That's right.
Yeah. All right. So if Confederate heritage means, as you've described, what it means to the people who, subscribe to it, and I guess I've described what it means to the rest of us. When the United States government now says that the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division should turn its attention to discrimination against white men, and when the U.S. Army removes the biography of Jackie Robinson from schools, and when the National Park Service decides to teach about the Underground Railroad but omits any mention of its conductor, Harriet Tubman, what message does that send to the folks at Beauvoir and the Sons of the Confederacy? And what message does it send to the rest of us?
Well, I can't speak for SCV, but I think it would send a message to them that they're winning, because they've fought for this for a very long time. For this, you go to their library in Beauvoir and the books that are in there. The South Was Right, which is a very famous, revisionist book, has been on the shelves, and so they would. They would be happy about that. The message to the rest of us, again, I can't speak for everybody. I think it's obvious the message it sends to black people. And, I'm not going to speak for them. It's a terrifying message. I think for white people, to me, it sends the message that we are not better than our past if we allow this to happen, right? This kind of revisionism and the twisting, because that's what's going on with all of this, is that they're just trying to, and I've warned for decades that this was going to happen through my own writing when I wrote about it online for the Village Voice, and people didn't want to listen. And so I've told people for a long time that, that what they're trying to do, including through, private schools that don't have to teach the same history standards and all of those things, and in the attacks on the public schools, is that there's a rewriting of history. And the rewriting of history is one more time going to benefit the ultimately the most powerful, who are trying to do it. And it's taking people's fears of each other, their kind of the prejudices that they grew up with. They're giving them a way to argue that those things are right. That those kinds of bigotry, even though they don't want to call it bigotry, are right. They don't want their kids to know the things like right here in Mississippi. They don't want us kids growing up here to know the things that happened. I grew up in Neshoba County. The 3 civil rights workers were killed when I was 3. I was never taught it in school. And I had to learn, I had to go to the library after a TV movie came out about it when I was 14. And I was really pissed off, because nobody was telling me this. And it's part of the reason I left Mississippi, saying I wasn't coming back. And so because they don't want us to know. And those of us who get educated, we like to say they'd really like to run us off. And they do run us off. That's the reason we have so much brain drain. And so, because we can't push back on that. And then there are so many politicians in our state, across the South and across the United States, who use this kind of fear and loathing even, that are built, these superiority/inferiority myths of dehumanization, which is something I'm working on a book that involves, to divide us. And that's how they maintain their power.
Yeah.
And, and so, but I have to say, I really challenge people across the country not to look at this like it's a Southern thing, which has happened way too long. And it helped us get where we are right now in the whole country.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you about that in a slightly different way. From where you sit, from having seen, I don't know what to call it. This hate is a virus. The lies about our past are a disease, a terrible. I don't want to use a health metaphor, but they're terrible for the country. They're terrible for if we have an idea of a national soul, it's poison. But right now, with the current administration in Washington, we are seeing an attempt to do to the whole country what you've lived through in your life in Mississippi. So what are the things that you would warn us most about, and what are the things that we need to be, most ready to raise our hand and say no? I mean, there are so many, and I'm wondering if there are some particular ones that just feel so familiar to you from your lived experience.
Oh, wow. So deep in at this point. I mean, the first thing I would say to the country here is drop the rose-colored glasses, about our history, about your own history. Learn your own history, because this whole BS about, pretending that Mississippi is the most racist place and I'm not defending that when I say that, understand what I'm saying, that all these things are either in the South or they're in Mississippi. They're in every state. And in some ways, very dramatic ways. The KKK for much of the century was stronger outside of Mississippi and outside of the South than it was in the South.
Chicago had the biggest chapter.
Well, good Lord, what was going on in the West Coast, and all over the country. Yep. So New York, all these places. So I say that to say, just stop this exceptionalistic idea that it can't happen here and it can't happen here again. So I think if you just let that go, and then you look at the lessons, you look, at, I think the obvious things are the censorship and all of that. I mean, people are seeing that now and they're outraged by it. But you also need to look at the efforts to drive people away from working together and from the division efforts, to take advantage, around education is, look, how many white liberals and progressives have supported segregated schools in their own ways and not supported the public schools, and also around crime and the kinds of hot button issues. When I was in New York, how many people thought that Giuliani and stop and frisk and broken windows, which grows out of a very dark place, were these amazing tools to make their lives safer. And so I guess my message is always about education, but it's kind of like just stop being naive and start kind of really listening to people and not writing off people who happen to know things you don't want to hear.
Yeah.
Don't treat us like we're nuts because we have taken the time to know how these puzzles fit together. I guess that's my big message because, I'm not one who's going to sit here and say, it's up to people how they protest and how they do certain things. But it's slightly more big picture for me. I just get sick of Americans being so naive about what can happen.
No, learn your history. It's the collective version of know thyself. It's very old and very powerful wisdom. Yep. Hey, let me just change for a little bit from this big story to just ask you, what are the impacts of the first 100 days of this Trump administration on your state? Are your schools, your universities feeling it? Are the cuts to food aid hurting people? Are there hospitals that are in jeopardy of closing? What are you seeing?
Well, I'll preface it by saying that, our hospital's already about to close before Trump.
Yep.
So many of the, we have so many things that we're already kind of on the precipice of that it's almost like in some ways, I think it's not as shocking of an impact as it might be in some other places that didn't see, that weren't already in a tough place and see things coming. I mean, certainly there are things like, our public schools are already beleaguered here, which is kind of ironic because there are a lot of places here where public schools are very important to white families too, depending on where they are, and so I think people are starting to see some of those things. Our Humanities Council, we did a story recently about the funds, and the Humanities Council is not seen as at least certainly by, any reasonable type person as like a big liberal thing here. They fund all kinds of amazing things, so we are definitely, we're seeing things that the rest of the country is seeing. I don't think and I'm one person talking, right? And other people might say different things, but I don't think they seem as dramatically different because we were already so far, in trouble, right? And in fact, there's been some good news. We've had this project going on for years we call Trusted Elections about polling precincts being moved at the last minute and all of these things. And, the legislature just passed a law that they can't be moved within 60 days of an election. And
that's congratulations.
Great about that. But thank you, because we were the only ones who did that kind of tedious work of putting out. And so there's some victories, I think, in that. Now, I think that they are, they are doing things to, ironically, Mississippi had not rolled back, I think, as much DEI and other kinds of quote unquote, because it's used as a catch-all these days, but roll back as many things as some other states. And I think now it's almost like I think we'll be forced to do as much, as some other, but who knows how far it can go. Now, one thing I do want to say to your listeners around the country, please stop this whole thing of saying, why do people live in Mississippi? Or why don't y'all stop it? Or why don't, because so many people are disempowered here and hurting and don't have the power to leave. Or it's really, and almost half the state routinely votes in a different way than people understand. We're the blackest state. And so that's a plea I have. All of us get really upset about that.
It's very fair, but it's also a warning to the rest of us because this feeling of being disempowered and not being able to do anything about it is exactly what this administration wants the whole country to feel.
Well, that's right. And then so imagine being, sitting in Illinois and the whole country turns on Illinois because of things that managed to happen in Illinois by the powerful, and people are having a hard time stopping it. And it just beats down people even more. I mean, it's so offensive. to us in Mississippi, especially on the ground, telling the truth. I mean, I live a more inclusive life here than I've ever lived anywhere. And I've lived in New York and Colorado and Massachusetts. I live among more active, engaged people than I ever who don't deny the reality of what can happen, like people in so many states have done for so long. So,
well, that's why I want everybody who listens to get to know you. I mean, I think you're afforded that chance in part because of where you live, but truly it's the life you chose. And that is a remarkable and wonderful thing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And, and please, and we have a whole staff. I'm not the only one.
Yep.
And we attract the kind of people who most of them are native Mississippians. And you can read MississippiFreePress.org is where you can see everybody's work. And I did a series of democracy essays that you may have seen, but that are before the election. That's drawing on all the history and all, pretty much everything I said was coming true. So, I'm not feeling happy about that necessarily, but thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
Well, listen, I really appreciate from time to time your coming and talking to me and this community of listeners, and they're not just listeners. There's call time, and people call in with a lot of, what they hear, and they react to it. And I know it's valuable to hear your voice, Don. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
You bet. Take care.
Edwin Eisendrath is taking your calls now at 773-763-9278. The Big Picture is on now. WCPT 820.
All righty, Jim, kick us off.
Yeah, hi, Edwin. I was listening to Maria Ressa, the Nobel Prize-winning journalist. She had a couple of conversations with Pope Francis, and they talked about the Internet and why 72% of the world was going dictator. And these people, their characters apparently don't matter to these people. Look at our situation. A young voter, you think, would take consideration of a person's character. You got Netanyahu on trial. You've got Putin, a murderer. You've got you name it. But yet they've consolidated power around the world. And I don't know if the younger people are aware of what a good character is or what a good character may be, but you think that they would flow along those lines. At least I would when I was a kid. I'm not pejoratively saying all kids are like that, but they seem to be influenced in a direction where they'll put up with a person who's a criminal. For instance, Trump is the absolute criminal. We know that who knows what he stole from the stock market, who knows what he stole in this crypto scheme that he's trying to put over. But apparently they'll shrug that off, and I don't know if they're giving up on democracy or not, Edwin. But anyway, you have a great show. Thank you, Edwin.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate that. I don't think they're giving up on it. I think they took it for granted, and the prospect of growing old without it has terrified them. I think we are seeing it coming together. I think the poll numbers, really terrible poll numbers for Donald Trump. Not that he doesn't deserve it. I don't feel sorry for him for 1 second. But Americans, young, old, well-educated, not educated, rural, urban, Republican, Democrat, all Americans think the things this administration has done are unacceptably bad for all of us. And they don't like it. They do not like it. So let's protect our elections and throw the people out, these guys. Young people will join us, Jim. I'm confident of that. Nancy.
Hi, Edwin. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing pretty well today.
Well, I'm not because, of course, of everything. But finally, glory, hallelujah, your last guest, I believe I was told her name is Donna Ladd, finally actually said the stuff I've been screaming about for years. and I can't believe that we are never going to get, and we shouldn't go back to what we were because we're never going to be perfect. Nobody is. But, from day one, we're still following the same rules or laws, whatever you want to call them, from day one. And because we have never been made a parliamentary government and have been following this, first one over the finish line wins, that's the reason the minority always will win, a couple exceptions. A clock is right twice a day. A broken clock is right twice a day. But the minority rules, and they will continue to, and that's the reason we have this scumbag in our White House for the second time. I can't believe this guy hasn't been beaten both times, because then we have the Dems who don't, I'm sorry, but they still don't know how to. And then we have the moderates who are controlling everything. I'm a progressive democratic socialist, proud one. I follow Bernie Sanders. He's the one who's had it right from day one, and they won't listen to him. They ignore him. Finally, when they see he's getting the crowd he's getting, and the Progressive Caucus is, that's a big reason, a big part of why Biden had such a successful administration, because he listened to Bernie and the progressives. And we finally started getting on the right track, and the Dems go screw it up again. There's no way that we've had a fair election at least since the electronic voting machines came in. But when our not-so-Supreme Court selected W, that was it. And we haven't fought back at all. We haven't fought back for 70 years. They didn't heed Eisenhower's words about the military-industrial complex. They never found out who actually killed Kennedy. They let Nixon go without prosecuting, and it's been downhill from there.
Well, that is an earful today. I got to say, to get the Kennedy assassination in there too, you're. I want to say you are full on today, Nancy.
You were saying about the what was it about the Confederacy that you were saying that they want to do in
9 states. This is Confederate Heritage Month.
Okay. Yeah. Well, why do you think they can do that? Do you think Germany would have ever allowed a swastika flying somewhere or anything like that? Because we never should have fought the Civil War in the first place, but we never finished it. This government is not proactive, it's reactive. It doesn't compromise, it concedes. They conceded to the South for everything. And that's why we still have slavery. We never ended it. And that's why they're still flying that damn flag and thinking they won. And that's why he got away with all through the last 4 years saying that, it was stolen and we were taking. Did the Democrats say anything? You're
yes.
Never going to convince me Harrison Wall, was that bad or never won any of those states and stuff. No one's ever going to convince me that last election was fair and free and fair, whatever you want to call it.
You have every right to think what you want to think. I don't think the facts back you up on that, Nancy, but you have every right to have your thoughts for sure. And I'm glad you. And I want to say, I'm glad you like Donna Ladd. I think she's terrific.
Yeah.
She's a daughter of the Confederacy, but she is an adult for the whole country. She's taken whatever it is she grew up with, and she has learned from it, and she is a treasure for the country. So I'm glad you liked her.
I am going to look into her, but I don't know why the Democrats won't say anything or won't contest anything and never argue about it. And I'm with David Hogg and all the other young people. Hopefully they're finally waking up and going to use their. They are.
Young people are definitely waking up, and you know what? And so are old guys. Dick Durbin, I think, was a terrific senator. I think he was a terrific legislator. I think he accomplished an amazing amount of things in his career, and yet he decided. He decided that he's done, and you know what? I'm proud of him for that. I'm proud of him. He fought all the way. He's still fighting, but he thinks it's time for.
But when I go to the voting booth and I don't want to vote for someone, and yet I have no other choice, no, that's not democracy.
Yeah, you've been clear about your views on that, for sure. All right, Nancy, I'm going to move on, but thank you. Max, you're next.
Oh, hi.
Hey,
so anyways, hey, how's it going? I was talking, the guy I was talking to answer the phone, the name of the book is The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And
yes.
That's the book that he wrote. And, you know, the funny thing about it is one day I was in Washington and I was talking to this young woman. I was standing at a street corner, and she told me she wrote her thesis on Frederick Douglass, and she didn't even know that he wrote a book because it's not widely advertised. And I don't know if you ever heard of that book, but people...
I have.
Okay.
Max, I was going to begin this show with a Frederick Douglass quote, but it was too long.
Okay.
But I think more and more his wisdom fits the time we're living in.
And what I was going to say is that about when I was reading that book right there, you know, he talks about when he left slavery and he went up to. I actually been to the home that he lived in New Bedford, up in Massachusetts. And so I was over there, and I was like, he lived there for a while before he moved to New York City, and he worked at, because he was a caulker. He used to put the caulking in on the boats, on wooden sailboats, you know, to keep them from leaking. And he said that when he was up there, you know, that he found the same issues with, you know, when as a free man as he felt when he was working as a slave, you know, and it was because of what they, you know, that you were jeopardizing other people's, you know, the amount of money that they were making, because, you know, you got to figure the guy's smart, so he's basically more like probably a real efficient worker. So, you know, other people that aren't efficient and they're making more than him, they're going to be looking at it as, hey, why don't I pay these guys this much money, you know, when this guy right here, you know. But anyways, he left that and he went down there and started that newspaper. But, you know, that's just to show you that we had the same situation. The difference is, I'm pretty sure that the white population in the United States is only 40%. So they're more threatened than they were back in the 70s or before that. You know, so their competition is really high. So, you know, so you're being pushed out of your lifestyle. And then not only that, you know, our economy is not doing good because since the 70s, 80s, you know, our government been allowing companies to move their businesses overseas so they can make more and more profits, you know, and it's putting our country at jeopardy. And when Trump says he's going to bring stuff back, he's not going to be able to bring stuff back. You know, he's lying to the people who voted for him, and that's pretty sad. But the sad thing about it is when people say that, hey, you know what? Why didn't you go out and vote for Kamala? Or, you know, and maybe because she wasn't going to change anything that was going on. She wasn't going to make life better for the American people. She wasn't going to do anything for the American people. And what was going to happen now, after listening to Schumer talk a while back, I was, you know, like thinking, I go, you know what? Now, you know, say like if Democrats are sick of voting for Democrats and you don't want to go out and vote, and Republicans are sick of Republicans and they don't want to go out and vote, and you want to start a new party, well, you know what? That's not going to happen, because, you know, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party is only something that you could vote for. And these people, these private parties, have control over the voting system. And they're not going to allow you, whatever you want to call your party, to move in and push them out without a revolution. And you know what's a revolution what's gonna happen? It's gonna be like what you're talking about, the Confederate Revolution, where people actually will have to die to basically be pushed out, and that is that's going to be the only way that things are going to change, and that's not going to happen. So we're going to go in the way that we're going for, I don't know, 10, 20 years, 30 years, but then in the end, this country is going to be a failed country. It's going to be a failed state, whatever you want to call it.
I happily, I mean, happily for me, I don't agree with that. This is a dark time for sure, and it is easy to find it hard to see any light.
There's no light because we're in a direction, and that direction that we're in, there's no turns. You know, and like I tell you, that I work for right now for just wealthy people. Before I used to work for upper middle class wealthy people, but we have less and less of them over the last 25 years. So those people, I very rarely work for them because they can't afford anything anymore. So they're gone. You know, so then all you got is the rich and the poor, and the middle class, the lower middle class, and whatever left you have, they're either moving down or they're moving with the richer part and supporting those people. That's all you have. So that right there, that divide puts a bigger divide in the United States than we already have. And
well, this is the time. I agree. Your criticism is correct. I think though. America has the capacity to change. We've demonstrated it in our history, and this is a moment where we have to do it again, for sure. The economy has not worked for people for far too long, and that's because all the gains have been sucked up at the top, and that's got to change. Definitely has to change. All right, I got to move on, but thank you.
Let me say something. If people would come on your show and talk about how we're going to change it instead of criticizing the other party, maybe we could do that for a little while, and then we could find change.
We'll get some of that as we get closer to the next election. Right now, because that's just when it comes, when we have candidates. But there are lots of ideas.
We don't have candidates. Okay.
No.
So I'm gonna be waiting, and I'm gonna be listening, and I'm gonna be hoping that basically that what you're talking about is true. But what I'm talking about, I know is true, and basically that we need to get people on that radio station that's going to talk about how they're going to change the United States for the better. You know, because I know we could do it, but but we need to have the right. You know how they say the right stuff? We need to have the right people.
All right. Okay. I appreciate it, Max. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right.
You bet. Roosevelt, how are you today?
Double E. Thank you for taking my call, my friend. Appreciate it. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Okay. Jasmine Crockett. Greg Kasar from Texas.
Yep.
The candidates that are running in this state for the spot of Durbin.
Yep.
All have one thing in common, and that is youth and minorities. And I'm very optimistic of what's going on. And I'm also, another sign is the fact these town halls, these Republican town halls, did you see the display of what happened, Marjorie Taylor Greene's town hall?
Yeah.
6 were arrested. 6 were arrested. So our First Amendment is not being respected because those people were there and they have a right to speak up. They have a right to ask questions. They avoided that. So all these town halls that the Republicans are having, they're really not town halls. People are speaking up, and people that particularly voted for Trump and voted for the Republican Party. And it's a great sign. Hopefully, also, with the crowds that AOC and Bernie Sanders are drawing, hopefully all this turns into votes against this party. I wouldn't say party, against Trump's party. Well, Trump's cult. So what do you think about that? I think it's very optimistic, and I think that the courts are going to put a stop to this, especially recently how they went against Trump as far as Supreme Court 9-0 and other federal courts as far as, taking all these kids and sending them without due process. That's all I have to say. What do you think of that?
I think it's good stuff. I agree with you. I think that we have turned a corner. I wish, we would hold elections sooner because America it does not like what they bought. We have a national buyer's remorse because we put a fascist in the White House. And, people don't like it. Thank you, Roselle. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Marty, you're going to be my last caller. What's on your mind?
Oh, hey, Edwin. Thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to piggyback off your guest there. And last week I actually had the joy of visiting Charleston, South Carolina, and did a tour of Fort Sumter and did this Magnolia Plantation tour, which really opens your eyes if you look at some of the houses that some of the slaves used to stay in, and just how dire of a situation these people had to have been in, and all the wealth that they generated for the rich there. All the big structures and all the big houses, it was all built on the backs of slave labor. Almost the entire city was funded on this small little auction block. And it's really, it's heartbreaking, it's enlightening, and, it's important for us to understand and recognize, the legacy and history of the Confederacy, and so that we never go back to that ever again.
Yeah, I wish you'd have taken Justice Kavanaugh with you. They pretend like that is ancient history, and there's none of it left in the DNA of the country when it is alive and well in this administration and their treatment of so many human beings in this country as if they are worthless. It's appalling. I'm glad you did it. Now, the only thing is that I can't call those places plantations. I've stopped being able to use that word for them 10 or so years ago when I learned more about them. I can only call them slave camps.
That's what it was.
Right. Yeah. I think it's part of the dishonest nostalgia to call them something else. Anyway, Marty, thank you so much for calling, and thank you all for participating today and being part of this community and helping get the word out. Bear witness, tell the truth, be tough. Don't tell anybody you're being too polite. Don't let them tell you don't let them tell you to be more polite. Get in their way, slow them down, call out their lies, and we will not only live through this moment, but we will be able to build a much better nation on top of it. Thank you all. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.